Hey guys, welcome in. Week 8 is here, finally upon us. Now into the second half of the season, coming down the home stretch. A lot of you guys looking to qualify for the playoffs at this particular point. Some of you guys, according to the emails, are in some real good shape, looking to solidify your rosters, really build some depth, and some other guys really just kind of fighting, scratching, and clawing to stay it alive. From the beginning of the season, from injuries to bad weather, back to injuries again. I have to say, and I'm just going to go out and say this because I don't really hide anything. And look, sometimes we hit some, sometimes we miss some. And for myself, same thing. Sometimes I hit some, sometimes I miss some. When it comes to the emails, try to do the best I can to provide you with enough information so that you can make the decisions that you need for your starting lineups. But I have to tell you, I emailed someone today, and I just flat out told him. I said, in the 8 years of being associated with the CFF site, this may be up until this point the toughest year that I have had. Just really projecting everything from players in the preseason to how they're panning out in the regular season, the injury situation. Just really been a tough season, I think, for a lot of you guys, myself included. I'm not going to hide from that. I've hit some, I've missed some, and we've just really gotten some bad luck. College fantasy football, college football in general, is just one of those sports where, we saw it tonight with the injury news of Bryce Love and N'Keal Harry. You just never know. And now we're going into week 8 with guys like maybe Myles Gaskin, who could be playing at maybe 80, 85%. You just don't know. And that's why I say it year in and year out. The draft matters, guys, but the in-season waiver wire means everything in college fantasy football, because you are at times throughout the season, whether it's bye weeks, whether it's injuries, you're going to have to go deep into that bench every single year. It doesn't really matter. And for as many times as I've preached to hold on to Bryce Love because of Stanford's year-end schedule, he's got to get to the year-end healthy for that actually to be fruitful for you guys. So, we're seeing it right now with A.J. Dillon, who I think has missed 2 games up until this point. So injuries just really, really costing some guys, and there's no two ways around it. A lot different than the NFL, where there is there's a formal injury report that has to be accurate. College football, you just never know, guys. And so that's why I say, when you're looking at the Laviska Shenaults this week with the toe injury, and the Myles Gaskin with the shoulder, or the Jatarvius Whitlow with the shoulder, I mean, we can go down the college football slate, and there is almost an injury every 2 or 3 games that is significant and impactful for college fantasy football. Sometimes that depth is important. That depth is so important because sometimes you have to err on the side of caution and start the guy that maybe on a weekly basis is going to give you 4 to 5 fantasy points fewer, but it sure the heck beats taking a goose egg for somebody. So that's sort of my advice leading into the week, and sort of my self-proclamation with just saying, hey, it's been a tough year, me included. And you know what? Let's see if things change. I mean, look, for some of you guys, it's already changing. I just checked before I came on here, the show. Justice Hansen, I believe, is looking like the 2017 Justice Hansen. And it's been quite some time since we've seen a game like that. I think he's accounted for 4 first quarter or first half touchdowns already. So good news for you guys if you started Justice Hansen. But with that being said, guys, let's see if that really kind of changes, and that's sort of a precursor for things to come here in week 8. And we're not going to waste any more time, guys. We're going to get right into it. We're going to go right into the start bench. And if you guys have any questions, want to submit anything to me during the show, go ahead and submit it. I'll check the thread at the end of the show, and we'll go ahead and knock those out, and we'll get off so you guys can check out that Stanford Arizona State game for those of you all that have players in that game. But we're going to jump right into the games tomorrow night. Colorado State playing at Boise State. 2 games tomorrow night. Both of them are in the Mountain West. And I think when you look at that matchup, guys, the one thing that's encouraging Colorado State, since they've come back from the bye, has sort of put the ball in the hands of Izzy Matthews, and he's paid dividends. It'll be interesting to see if he can do anything against Boise State. I'm not overly optimistic with that matchup, but Given that Rashad Body is now no longer with the team, that's just one less back. And I think Izzy Matthews is going to be the main back from here on out. It seems like Colorado State took that bye week a couple of weeks ago and kind of regrouped. It'll be interesting. I think if there's one player for Colorado State that could have a good game against Boise, you're probably looking at Preston Williams, who's been fairly reliable this year, this season. Over on the Boise State side, still really looking for that monster game from Alexander Madison. I don't know if we're going to get it this week. I'm hopeful that we can, but guys like John Hightower, A.J. Richardson, the receivers for Boise State now have been a pleasant surprise. And I think this could be a good game for the Boise State passing game. Air Force playing tomorrow night at UNLV. I'm going to touch on this. There is a player in this game that comes up later on in the start bench. Just sort of a little foreshadowing right here. Tough matchup for UNLV. Ever since they lost Armani Rogers, the offense just hasn't looked the same. And why would it? Air Force on the other side, I think this is a good matchup for them. The problem that I have with Air Force is I like them to win this game. As a matter of fact, I've been pretty good with throwing out a few picks every week on teams that I really like to cover the spread. I really like Air Force this week. They've a few statistics on Air Force. They held San Diego State last week, I think, to 84 yards rushing. I believe they held Navy to 100 and maybe 30 yards rushing this year. And I know that's not saying a lot given the trouble of the Navy offense, but it's still Navy. And they held Devin Singletary, FAU's Devin Singletary, I think, to 56, 57 yards rushing earlier this year. You have to go all the way back to week 1 of 2017 for Devin Singletary to have rushed for as few yards as that. Since Devin Singletary has become a regular starter, no team has held him down from a rushing yard standpoint as Air Force did this year. It was his lowest rushing output in 19 games. I like the Air Force defense in this game. If you have a chance to pick them up, that I think is the play from a fantasy standpoint in FBS. Michigan playing on the road at Michigan State. And guys, all of the big games on Saturday are going to be during the day. There are very few games slated to kick off late. So I'm going to assume a lot of the fantasy matchups will be determined by the time the sun goes down and the sun sets on Saturday evening. But Michigan playing at Michigan State, I do not know if Michigan can play any better than they did against Wisconsin. And obviously Michigan State playing at home against Michigan after a big win against Penn State. I am a little concerned for Karan Higdon in this game. And, I know what you're saying. Miles Sanders was on your bench list last week, Joe, and he hit for like 160 plus yards and a touchdown against Michigan State's vaunted run defense, which is tops in the nation and still number 1 in the nation. But here's what I'll say to that. It was quite obvious that Michigan State was going to take away Trace McSorley. Trace McSorley had his worst game of the year. So Michigan does not have a Trace McSorley. Michigan is going to run the ball and play defense. And for me, now the Spartans go back to their base defense. I think they take away the run, and they're going to make Shea Patterson in that Michigan passing game beat them. Now, when you look at Michigan State, who do they have that's really going to, light your fire from a fantasy standpoint? I think right now you ride the hot hand with Felton Davis if you have him in a wide receiver 3 or a flex spot. You kind of ride that hot hand at the receiver position until it goes cold. And right now that's Felton Davis. Karan Higdon, I think you'd really have to be in a pinch and you'd have to be thin at running back to get him in. I am a little concerned about him on the road this week at Michigan State. Oklahoma, after a bye week, playing on the road at TCU. And when you look at TCU, I'm just not sold on Sean Robinson as the long-term quarterback for TCU. What does that mean from a fantasy standpoint this week? Well, here's the thing. I'm just not sure. If you play in a league where you lose points for turnovers, Robinson can be a liability for you. Now, chances are Oklahoma, there could be a few more points scored in this game than I think. It's not going to be, I think, the 17-14 game that you saw out of TCU, Texas Tech last week. So I do think Rager's in play, the wide receiver for TCU. I do think Turpin is in play. And over on the Oklahoma side, obviously you've got Kyler Murray, who is going to be a top quarterback every week. He's a must start. And Marquise Brown and CeeDee Lamb, I think, are must plays. If you're talking about guys that may be in play, maybe Sermon, you throw him in there based on whether you're in a conference specific or Power 5 league. But for me, the main plays in this game are on the Oklahoma side with Kyler Murray, CeeDee Lamb, and Marquise Brown. Maryland playing on the road at Iowa, and I know I mentioned on this show last week how solid Nate Stanley has been as a quarterback and a fantasy quarterback, whether you're playing Power 5 or full FBS. He has accounted for 10 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. And I mentioned last week, take guys like Jarrett Stidham, Brian Lewerke, who are all projected to be higher than Stanley. And Stanley right now is rising above all of those guys with a decent matchup this week, playing on the road. Playing at home against Maryland. And right now, Noah Fant and Hockenson, TJ Hockenson are must starts, even if you have to play them at a wide receiver position. I know my league we don't require tight ends, but we play with tight ends as a receiver. And I have to tell you, those guys are both worth starting at the receiver position. Cincinnati playing on the road at Temple, a question mark around Raquel Armstead again, another player with a question mark that you've got to be really careful about because he did not play last week. I'm always concerned about guys that don't play a game because I hate to even play them. My rule of thumb most of the time is when a guy misses a game, I usually don't play him again until he actually plays a game. And yes, I take a chance on missing a good game from him, but I'm also avoiding taking a zero for him. For instance, A.J. Dillon last week was going to be another game time decision. We were very fortunate to get news that A.J. Dillon was not going to play a lot earlier than kickoff, so you were able to make the substitute. It always helps the early if there's ever a player that's questionable, it's always helpful to get him in that 11, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock slate for college fantasy football. The later the game is, the more you have to kind of be proactive from starting a guy that may not be injured over a guy that has a question mark over his head. And for me, Raquel Armstead this week in a really tough matchup against Cincinnati. And if you're looking at the Cincinnati side, you've got Ritter and you've got Warren, I think are must starts as well, even against a Temple. But as you can see, the common theme developing now, and we're not even that many games down the slate, are just the questions with injuries, is what seems to be what I've talked about the most since I've actually come on the air. Illinois playing on the road at Wisconsin, and obviously Jonathan Taylor is going to be the play. Maybe Wisconsin defense is going to be a play for you there as well. Buffalo playing on the road at Toledo in a game that could have quite a few points in it. What's really interesting for me is just how different Toledo looks as an offense this year compared to last year. You looked at the offense and you said, wow, they're going to flip their quarterback. They're going to get another quarterback, but that quarterback's got Cody Thompson, Deontay Johnson, and John Vea Johnson, and Shaquille Seymour coming back. Toledo's going to be stacked. They're going to throw up some points. Right now, the guy to have for Toledo is Michael Guadagni, the quarterback. Dual threat guy. He's actually stealing the thunder from a fantasy perspective. And Shaquille Seymour, I actually picked him up in a league last week because he's been so inconsistent all year. I found him on the waiver wire. I was in a pinch. He did give me 60 yards and a touchdown. Is that a sign for him to turn it around? I don't know. We'll see. I'm not overly optimistic. Buffalo has been really steady all year. And when you look at Buffalo, another question mark, an injury. Kevin Marks again, right? So you've got Jarrett Patterson, the freshman. He's going to play. If you have him, he's in your lineup. If you have him, you don't want Marks to play. If you have Marks, it's a question mark. Do I get him in? Do I not get him in? Last week, he was a question mark to play, and he played. Still have a question mark by his name. Anthony Johnson had a question mark by his name for 3 or 4 weeks in a row. I think he played last week and had 2 catches. KJ Osborne right now is the player to have. And Tyree Jackson, if you have him, could be a good matchup to where he comes back to some of those numbers he was delivering for you in the beginning of the year. Buffalo has taken on, it seems like their identity has switched from the beginning of the year where they were pass heavy, leaning on Tyree Jackson, and all of a sudden now they're run heavy, leading on the two freshman running backs. So Patterson and Marks. So real interesting to see this matchup unfold. I think you're going to get a little bit more from Tyree Jackson, the Tyree Jackson that you had in the first part of the season. But we'll see. We'll see how that unfolds. Tulsa playing on the road at Arkansas, and here we go again. Tulsa running backs. Brooks misses a game, Taylor goes off, has a good game. Taylor misses the next game, Brooks is in, he has a good game. Do they both play this weekend? I think that they do. All of a sudden they're on a road at an SEC opponent, Arkansas. I don't think Arkansas is great, but Arkansas is picking up a little momentum. You can see Arkansas making some improvements on the offensive side of the football. I actually think if there's one player in this game that I like, that I'm more secure about than any player right now, it's not the two running backs from Tulsa because I think they're both going to get carries. I just, sometimes it's a flip of the coin of who's going to find the end zone and who's not. Raheem Boyd. Raheem Boyd is the name to have this week. I think he has a good game for Arkansas. And once again, Cheyenne O'Grady, the tight end at Arkansas. Let's see what happens with Ty Story, who was hurt last week. I think he plays this week. Seems like he's practicing. Another guy with a question mark as well. But it looks favorable for him to get the start this week. Ole Miss playing at home against Auburn. I already mentioned Jatarvius Whitlow at the top of the show. Shoulder injury, questionable. Will he give it a go? Will he not? He did last week. Whether he plays is one thing. Whether he plays healthy is another. Great matchup against Ole Miss. I mean, on paper, this is the matchup you've been looking for a couple of weeks now out of Jatarvius Whitlow, and now you've got to start him and kind of cringing whether or not he's going to give you a solid outing against Ole Miss, or does Auburn throw in another running back that might be healthy? And on the Ole Miss side, you lose DK Metcalf to an injury for the season. So all of a sudden now, DK Metcalf was actually having a better fantasy season than A.J. Brown. But it does improve the stock of A.J. Brown now because Metcalf is gone. And I think if you have DeMarcus Lodge, you stick him in the lineup in there as well. And Jordan Ta'amu, the quarterback for Ole Miss, definitely have to ride his hot hand, even against a decent Auburn defense. Because here's the problem. If Auburn's offense doesn't improve and their defense has to stay on the field, I can see where Ole Miss is going to wear them down a little bit and score some points. Maybe this matchup's a little higher scoring than we think. It'll be interesting to see. And if you have Scotty Phillips, the running back, I think you get him in there as well. I just don't see the ceiling for Ole Miss way up here this week, but I think those are going to be some quality starters for you this weekend. Rutgers playing at home against Northwestern, and in this matchup, I'm looking at Clayton Thorson, the quarterback for Northwestern, and Flynn Nagel, the wide receiver of Northwestern, who's just been red hot. Those are the two guys that you want in the lineup this week. Miami of Ohio playing on the road at Army. Interesting stat on this matchup, guys. I believe that Army's defense, and I don't like any of the Miami of Ohio players, and I know Kenny Young has been hot as of late. His last two matchups, he's gone off. But Army, I believe, have held Hawaii, Liberty, and San Jose State to their second lowest scoring totals of the year, and held Oklahoma and Buffalo, both two pretty good offenses, to their lowest point total of the year. So Army's defense is legit, guys. So I wouldn't expect much from Miami of Ohio this weekend. North Carolina playing on the road at Syracuse. Michael Carter has the hot hand for North Carolina, but here's something we've seen a number of times this year where a guy has one good week and then you want to stick him in there, and you've got to be really careful. North Carolina going on the road to Syracuse. Syracuse has been pretty good this week. If you need a player like Carter, he's somebody that you can look at, somebody you can throw in there maybe in a pinch at running back, maybe get him in there at flex, but I don't want to say and guarantee that he's going to deliver for you because it is North Carolina. It's been a very inconsistent offense, and when you talk about offense and throw in Syracuse, it's amazing that we are 8 weeks into the season, and with the only thing that with Syracuse we can deliver is that Dungy is going to be solid. We don't have a clear-cut receiver, number one receiver, which is really different for Syracuse, and their second-best fantasy lock as far as a guarantee is their kicker. So if you've got Dungy and you've got the Syracuse kicker, get him in your lineup this week. Virginia playing on the road at Duke. Virginia, I said on the show last week, Miami, tough matchup going into Virginia, and Virginia took that one from right underneath them. I think when you look at this matchup, if you need Perkins, it's a really tough matchup against a decent Duke defense. You'd have to be really depleted on your depth at quarterback to get Perkins in. I think last week was his first game of the season where he did not throw at least 2 TD passes. I do think he's going to give you a little bit on the ground. Just I do not know how many points Virginia's going to be able to get at Duke. Could be a low-scoring game. So even though the yardage total for Perkins could be decent, I'm a little concerned about how many points he could give you. Same goes for Deion Jackson, the running back for Duke. I mean, Britton Brown didn't play last week. Deion Jackson, I believe, had 21 carries. He's going to get most of the work again. if Britton Brown is out. He could be a decent option as well as a running back 3 flex play as well. And the guy that I want to talk about too is Olamide Zaccheaus, who I was high on Perkins and Zaccheaus at the beginning of the year. The one thing that Zaccheaus isn't doing, the reason, and he's been a little inconsistent with receivers. He's receiving numbers. He's actually had, I think, 3 or 4 really good games. He isn't running the ball as much as he was last year, or as much as we thought that he would out of the backfield. Jordan Ellis has actually been really good out of the backfield, so they have not needed Zaccheaus out of the backfield. To me, if Zaccheaus was giving you somewhat of more rushing numbers on a consistent basis, then his season would look completely different up until this point. But I think he's only got 5, maybe 5 rushing attempts for about 22 yards, and that's not what we were expecting from Zaccheaus after what he showed last week, and how reports coming out of camp were saying that he was working as the H-back and kind of getting some passes out of the backfield as a receiver and working as a running back as well. He's almost been used exclusively as a receiver this year. Idaho State playing on the road at Liberty. Obviously, news of Antonio Gandy Golden hurt, another player. Here we go. We didn't go many games before we mentioned a hurt player. So he's out. So I think with that, you look at B.J. Farrow, the wide receiver at Liberty. I think this could be a game for Stephen Calvert if you need need a second quarterback in a 2-quarterback full FBS league. Maybe this is a good matchup for you, and maybe you can steal something if you need a wide receiver play with DJ Stubbs or maybe Frankie Hickson, the running back at Liberty. Bowling Green playing on the road at Hawaii, and let's not waste any time and talk about an injury. Andrew Clare seems to be in a walking boot all week. I have to tell you, as an owner of Andrew Clare, I'm not putting him in my lineup as of right now, based on everything that I've heard. If you're still in a walking boot come Wednesday, that's not a good sign for your playing prospects on the weekend. So when it comes to Bowling Green, you may want to look at Daigie, the quarterback. Obviously, Miller, the receiver. Maybe Quentin Morris. But be interesting to see how Bowling Green looks with the flip at the head coaching at the coaching position. Now that they've got a new coach, and over at with Ohio. Nathan Rourke, who was very high on our preseason list, still waiting for that really monster game from him. I think he had one good game this year, or really looking for a monster game from him on a consistent basis like he did last year. Maybe this is the matchup. Maybe this is the matchup that Nathan Rourke has for you, gets over the hump, working towards the second half of a big second half of the season, playing one of the worst run defenses in the FBS, and Bowling Green could be a monster game for Nathan Rourke. And you know what? If you really need some deep plays in FBS, I think you really have to take a look at Malik Irons and AJ Ouellette, the 2 running backs for Ohio, because if Nathan Rourke's not going to get it done, it's going to be one of those guys, because Ohio is going to run the ball this weekend against Bowling Green. Wyoming playing at home against Utah State. Utah State, the second highest scoring offense in the FBS behind Oklahoma. They've been an absolute juggernaut. As far as Wyoming goes, their defense is going to have to keep them in the game. Nico Evans is going to have a big game. If you have him, maybe you give him a spot in a flex position this weekend. And when you look at Utah State, you've got Jordan Love, obviously the quarterback, Ronquavian Tarver. You can get a nice play at receiver as well. Darwin Thompson, Gerald Bright have been solid at the running back spots. Now, they are playing on the road, and they are playing at Wyoming, so I do think you can start them if you need them, but I also think you need to consider your matchups before you go ahead and start those guys, because it's not a guarantee. Wyoming is a tough team to play in Laramie, and a road game at Wyoming, I can see where Utah State has a little bit more trouble than what they're accustomed to on a weekly basis in this particular matchup. Florida Atlantic playing on the road at Marshall, and obviously you've got Devin Singletary. You're sticking him in there, even though Marshall has been pretty good against the run. And speaking of Marshall, Tyler King, one of my preseason picks who I really liked, now that Keon Davis has been out of the way, has really taken off the last 2 games. It'll be interesting to see if they continue to feed Tyler King, and it was nice to see Tyree Brady get back on track after a subpar game 2 weeks ago. Got back on track last week, and I think you get Tyree Brady in your lineup as well. Charlotte playing on the road against Middle Tennessee. Charlotte, if you look at the statistics, are actually a little bit better against the run than what you might think. However, Tavares Thomas is decent at finding the end zone for Middle Tennessee. I just don't think Middle Tennessee is going to be able to run the ball that much. And you know what? Maybe this is a sneaky game to get Benny LeMay back into your starting lineup. Maybe this is the game where somebody like Victor Tucker, the wide receiver for Charlotte, is a sneaky play. And here's why. Brent Stockstill, still a question mark going into this game. Is he going to play? Is he not? So here we go, another game down the slate, and we're talking about a questionable quarterback in Brent Stockstill, who is probably on many fantasy rosters. And because of his question mark, it creates an opportunity for the Charlotte side to be able to control the ball a little bit more because maybe Middle Tennessee isn't as efficient moving the ball on offense on their side. Ball State playing, Ball State playing at home against Eastern Michigan. And for me, Eastern Michigan's actually been one of the surprise teams this year. They've actually been very competitive in a lot of games that they've played. And if you need a sneaky play for quarterback, go look at Mike Glass for Eastern Michigan. If you're in an FBS league, full FBS, 2 quarterback league, and you're struggling right now filling that second or third quarterback slot because you don't have any depth, go look at Mike Glass for Eastern Michigan. Give him some consideration. Decent matchup this week playing on the road at Ball State. Western Michigan playing on the road at Central Michigan. I'll start with the road team in this, Levante Bellamy. He was on the start list last week. Monster game. I think he had 145 yards, but it was Jamari Bogan who stole all 4 of the rushing touchdowns. Unfortunately, for many of you guys that started Bellamy, Bogan actually had the better fantasy game by taking those 4 into the end zone. But you also have options with John Wasik, the quarterback. You have Jaden Reed, the receiver, Dwayne Eskridge. So a ton of options here and a good matchup for Western Michigan playing on the road against Central Michigan. And when you look at Central Michigan, a couple of things to note here. Tommy Lazzaro, the quarterback, has had 2 consecutive 100-yard rushing games. Now, I don't have a lot of confidence in starting him every week because they're not scoring a ton of points anyway, so I don't know if you're going to get any consistency on that part. But you want to add Romello Ross, the running back for Central Michigan, onto your watch list. Jonathan Ward didn't play last week. We all know that Jonathan Ward has struggled this week. Romello Ross, a 100-yard game last week. So I don't know if you take a chance on him this week. If you're in a pinch, there could be worse players on the waiver wire. Maybe that's a name for you that's still available in your league. 100-yard game last week, and maybe they ride Lazzaro and Ross hot hand and see if they could take a win out from Western Michigan in conference. Alabama playing on the road at Tennessee. Nothing I like about Tennessee, even though they're at home. And at Alabama, I don't even know. It's like I may as well just record and hit play every single week. They're going to spread it out. Tua Tagovailoa is definitely the start. Jerry Jeudy is definitely a start. Damian Harris picking up a little steam from a fantasy perspective. Looks like a decent start. And then you throw guys in there. Irv Smith, the tight end. You throw in, Ruggs, the receiver. And then even the kicker as well for Alabama are fantasy options, not slam dunks. I would think of the last 3 guys that I mentioned, I would look at Ruggs and I would look at Bolovas, the kicker, as 2 more considerable options in that game. North Carolina State playing on the road at Clemson. And boy, what a good game this one should be. North Carolina State seems to play Clemson tough. And, quite a few emails coming in about Trevor Lawrence this week, and I'm going to give you my perspective on Trevor Lawrence. I think I said this 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'm going to say it again. Clemson can be as good. They could be top 2 in the country, and Trevor Lawrence could be the top, maybe second best quarterback in the country. But we're playing college fantasy football. Being a great quarterback just doesn't translate to being a great fantasy quarterback. So we can sit here and say that Trevor Lawrence is a stud. He's going to throw a couple of touchdowns every week. But is that going to be enough for you to make him a top 15, 20 fantasy quarterback every week? Obviously, Travis Etienne's got the hot hand. That offense is going through Travis Etienne right now. They are feeding him. Now, here's the concern. North Carolina State's defense isn't bad. North Carolina State, if I'm North Carolina State right now, I know what we're doing is we have to stop Travis Etienne. You've got to make the freshman beat you, which he can. I mean, the Ross and Higgins on the outside, I can see them being starts this week. But there's nothing guaranteed in this matchup. Conference matchup, tough matchup. North Carolina State run defense is good. I would not expect a 200-yard, 2-touchdown game from Travis Etienne. But give me my 125 and touchdown. Everything after that is cake. On the North Carolina State side, Reggie Gillespie has had a hot hand. things are going to be tough for him too to get going, especially against that Clemson defense. I think if there's fantasy points on the North Carolina State side, it's going to come from Kelvin Harmon and Jacoby Myers at the receiver position. I'm not saying they're going to score a ton of points, but if you play in a PPR league, those are the two guys that I'm looking at in this matchup for North Carolina State. Colorado playing on the road at Washington, and really for me, the storyline of this game is Laviska Shenault and Myles Gaskin going to play. My guess is they're both going to play. My guess is they're both not going to be 100%. My guess is if I had to pick one, I'm taking Laviska Shenault. And I know it's against Washington's defense. But guys, let me give you a note on this. Laviska Shenault and Darrell Henderson for Memphis. Both of those guys are outscoring the second best player at their position from a fantasy perspective by at least 5 fantasy points. Their weekly average is 5 fantasy points better than the second best guy. That's absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. And so, yeah, Laviska Shenault isn't going to give you 30 fantasy points against Washington, but you're getting receiver points and running back points out of to me, it's just a no-brainer. As long as Shenault is a definite play, he's in. Fresno State playing on the road at Indiana, and this is what I'm looking at. I'm sorry, Penn State playing on the road at Indiana. Obviously, Penn State trying to recover from that loss against Michigan State. I think this is going to be a huge bounce-back game for Trace McSorley. You've got Trace McSorley. You get him in the lineup. I think it's a solid matchup for Miles Sanders, KJ Hamler, the wide receiver. And I think if you have Pat Freiermuth, the tight end, I think he's somebody you need to look at too. He's been fairly consistent. He's not blowing it up. But if you've been struggling for a tight end, maybe he's available and somebody that you want to look at. Coastal Carolina playing on the road at UMass, and with UMass, Andy Isabella is an absolute slam dunk start. I think you've got to look at Marquise Young in this matchup as well. I would recommend a UMass quarterback, but I don't know if we got full clarity on there between Comas and Ford. Those guys have been banged up. I want to say it's going to be Ford, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And over on the Coastal Carolina side, we know the UMass run defense is bad. If you've got Marcus Outlow, you get him in the lineup this week. Houston playing on the road at Navy, and I'm going to touch on Houston first before I get into Navy. Obviously, you've got De'Ara King must start, Marquez Stevenson must start, and Keith Corbin I still think is a start, even though he's kind of tapered off a little bit. Over on the Navy side, here's my recommendation. I'm staying away from Navy. As a matter of fact, I play in a league. I own Malcolm Perry in a league, and I actually dropped him this week. I can't sit on a guy that's going to give me 7, 8, or fewer fantasy points. I actually took a risk. I dropped him this week in a 2-quarterback league that I have Kyler Murray and Bryce Perkins in that league, and did not feel great about both of those guys' matchups, and I could not. I did not want to hold on to Malcolm Perry. I did pick up, I believe it was Stephen Calvert from Liberty, and I'm taking a shot with him. But right now, I'm staying away from Navy until we figure out what's going on. The offenses just look bad. Perry's been used, was moved to the slot last week as a slot back. Whether or not he gets moved back to quarterback remains to be seen. Still maybe injury concerns as well because he's left with a concussion already. I just don't see any fluidity out of that Navy offense, or really continuity is probably the better word that I was looking for. So I'm staying away from Navy right now. SMU playing on the road at Tulane, and we know that Tulane beat Memphis a couple of weeks ago. It'll be interesting to see if Tulane can take down SMU at home, and I think Darius Bradwell is a good play. I think Darnell Mooney is a good play for Tulane, and over on the SMU side, if you've got Braden West, if you have James Proche, I think those are must-starts as well. Akron playing on the road at Kent State. Sometimes there's just those matchups. It's really amazing for me that we've got a MAC matchup that there's just really not to mention. But I don't really, at this particular point in the season, we're 8 weeks in. We're not really looking for sleepers from, I think, Akron and Kent at this particular point, knowing that we're not going to really get much consistency. I remember throwing out McCoy last week as somebody that had a hot hand at the receiver spot for Kent State. I think he only caught 2 or 3 passes last week, and I think that's the issue you're going to run into, whether you've got Barrett, the quarterback for Kent State, or you have Cato Nelson, the quarterback for Akron. You just have to worry about whether or not you're going to get consistency. And at this particular point, 8 weeks into the season, I want some. I'm looking for consistency more than I am looking for that 1 week matchup, unless I absolutely am depleted at a particular position. Louisiana Lafayette playing on the road at Appalachian State. I think you still get Regis in the lineup, the running back, and I still think you take a shot with Jamarcus Bradley, the wide receiver at Louisiana Lafayette. But over on the Appalachian State side, two players that you're going to put in your lineup. Quarterback Zach Thomas is going to be in there. And obviously Darrington Evans, who takes over, who seems like he'll take over for Jalen Moore at running back. There's a lot of you guys that may have him at a wide receiver position. Over on Fantrax if you're playing there too. So you may get running back points out of the out of wide receiver with Darrington Evans. Louisiana Tech playing at home against UTEP. Interesting note of Louisiana Tech. Jaquez Dancy did return last week. I think he had 21 carries, but I don't even think he had 40 yards. But it was interesting to see that he was getting most of the work out of the backfield. I do think Adrian Hardy is still worth a play. I'm still not particularly sold on Teddy Veal as well. Matchups against UTEP. I think this could be a weekend. If you need Jamar Smith, maybe you take a chance with him this weekend. Florida State playing at home against Wake Forest. And, I think when you look at Wake Forest, if you have Hartman and Dortch, you get them in your lineups. Florida State's defense has not been great. They've been okay some weeks, but they haven't been great. And when you look at Florida State, you think you really have to look at that Wake Forest defense. And, Wake Forest defense has not been that good. I do think that this could be, and I've said this maybe once or twice already this year, especially when Florida State played Louisville, maybe this is Cam Akers' week. He's only got one touchdown and doesn't have a 100-yard game this year. Is this the week where he gets his 100 yards and a touchdown? I think it's worth a shot. I actually think this could be a decent week if you need to take a shot on a DeAndre Francois. I actually like Tamorrion Terry this week. I think he could be a great sleeper receiver in this game. And I think Naquan Murray could be an option for you as well. Nebraska playing at home against Minnesota, and I think when you look at Minnesota, you've got two options. Mohamed Ibrahim, the running back, and you've got Ty Johnson, the receiver. When you look at Nebraska, it's interesting. Nebraska hasn't won a game yet, but it seems like we've got some really good fantasy options, which is absolutely crazy. I mean, you've got Martinez at quarterback that's been pretty decent. You've got J.D. Spielman that's been playing lights out at receiver. Stanley Morgan is an option at receiver. And now it looks like Devon Ozigbo has thrown his hat into the middle of the ring and said, hey, guys, you need to start me. I think he's gone over 100 yards in 2 of the last 3 games, with that one game, I think, being Wisconsin that he did not. So solid options in this game from a Nebraska standpoint, even though they have not won a game. Texas Tech playing at home against Kansas, and were we going to see Alan Bowman return? It seems like, based on the news that's coming out of Lubbock, that he is not. Looks like it's going to be Jet Duffy. And, I felt like it was going to be Jet Duffy leading up to last week, because here's my thing with Jet Duffy. The offense takes on a different dimension with Jet Duffy, okay? You have to prepare. You have to spend a few days preparing the offense for Jet Duffy's style compared to and you have to have a different scheme for Alan Bowman. So when I knew Jet Duffy was getting most of the practice last week, I didn't see any reason to think that anybody else was going to be the starter in last week's job, that I thought it was going to be Jet Duffy's unless he looked absolutely bad, and then they would maybe throw in McLean Carter. I think that this week as well. I think they have been, now Duffy's been incorporated into the offense for 2 weeks. I think this is a big game for Jet Duffy. I don't think he's the long-term option at Texas Tech. Alan Bowman, in my opinion, is definitely the better quarterback, but Jet Duffy has a great matchup this week in a game where he probably doesn't have to throw the ball much. Texas Tech can play defense against Kansas. They can run the ball a lot, hit one over the top with Antoine Wesley, maybe get one to Jadion High. Because I don't even know if TJ Vasher is going to play in this game, but I do like Jet Duffy in this game, and I like for Texas Tech to beat Kansas pretty good in this matchup. Missouri playing at home against Memphis, and look, here we go. Memphis playing on the road at Missouri. Missouri, decent run defense. What does that say for Darrell Henderson? I still think you start him. When you're the best fantasy running back in college football, I don't think you find the bench. I think you have to live and die with Darrell Henderson in this matchup. Unless you have 2 of maybe the other 5 running backs in the top 5 of our weekly rankings, then maybe you sit Henderson, but I don't think there's many fantasy owners in that position. quite honestly, I just think that Darrell Henderson has looked too good. He's not going to give you 200 yards and 2 touchdowns in this game, likely. I mean, he may. But the one good thing about Henderson is he's special. I mean, he could take any ball to the house. He can do damage in the pass game if he's not getting in a run game. They could dump it off to him. Guy's capable of a big play. And with Henderson, you only need really 2 big runs for him making him worth a fantasy start. So if he breaks a 45-yard touchdown run and catches a pass for 65 yards and a touchdown, boom, you're done. One of the top fantasy backs of the week. So that's my take on Darrell Henderson. I still think you've got to get him in your lineup. And over on the Missouri side, obviously Emmanuel Hall looks like he's still out. So Albert Aguegbaum, the tight end for Missouri, I think is a play. I think Drew Lock gets back on track this week. This is a great matchup for him. But here's the question. Will Drew Lock air it out, considering that guys like Hall are out, when you've got Larry Roundtree and you've got Damarier Crockett in the backfield to hand it off? I actually can see those 2 guys maybe getting 12 to 15 carries apiece, and one of them maybe, if not 2, getting 100 yards rushing. And if so, that's not great for Drew Lock's fantasy prospects, but I still like Drew Lock. I think this is a bounce-back game for him. I think they're going to want to really get back on track. But here's why I like Darrell Henderson. For Missouri, they need to win this game because bowl eligibility becomes a question mark as they move into conference play. When you look at the Missouri schedule and see the teams that Missouri just played and the teams they still have to play, I don't know how they can be up for Memphis because they have good teams. This game is perfect. Is sandwiched perfectly for Memphis to come in there and give Missouri everything that they can handle because Missouri's got tough conference. They just played tough conference games and they've got tough ones right after this. So really, if I don't want to say this is a trap game because I think Missouri's going to win this game, but I think Memphis is going to show themselves a little better than what I think most people expect this weekend. Oregon State playing at home against Cal, and here we go. Bad Oregon State defense. You've got Patrick Laird, the running back for Cal, Brandon McElwain. If he gets a majority work as the Cal quarterback, I could see those 2 guys. I could see both of them going over 100 yards in this game in a great matchup on the road at Oregon State. When you look at Oregon State, here's the question mark. You got Jamar Jefferson. Jamar Jefferson has been one of the best fantasy backs this year. And that was considering Artavis's, despite Artavis Pierce's big game in the beginning of the year against Ohio State. So now Artavis Pierce came back last game. Oregon State had a bye. How does Pierce now, how do they work him back in there? Does he become running back 1? Does he stay running back 2? Here's my take, and this is just my opinion, and I could be wrong. It is going to be incredibly difficult to leave Jefferson on the bench, knowing and seeing what he has done consistently over the last few weeks. I think that Jefferson is going to be the running back 1. I could be wrong, but that's my opinion. I don't know how a player looks that good for that long, and then all of a sudden you say you're the running back 2. I think Pierce is the running back 2, but I think Pierce gets more work. I see them splitting carries more, and it would not surprise me if this is a game where we see 4 running backs, 4 players, top 100 yards rushing. McElwain and Laird on that side, and maybe Pierce and Jefferson on the Oregon State side. I do like Jefferson better than Pierce until I see something different out of Oregon State on the field. New Mexico State playing at home against Georgia Southern, and I think for this matchup, it comes down to Shai Werts and Wesley Fields, the quarterback and running back for Georgia Southern. Shai Werts should have a bounce-back week this week after a subpar week last week, again, in a game that they struggled at Texas State. I think both of those guys find the end zone this week. Mississippi State playing a tough road matchup at LSU. Tough matchup for Nick Fitzgerald and the Mississippi State offense. They haven't been great, although they were solid in a matchup last week. Tougher matchup going on the road against LSU. But look, LSU, they're catching them, I think, between Georgia and Alabama. This could be a good time to catch LSU, but I have to tell you, with the way that LSU's playing, it seems to me that they're just going to wear down Mississippi State. I do think that Nick Brissett, and I even think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a decent play as well on the LSU side. East Carolina playing at home against Central Florida, and I think with Central Florida right now, the 2 best plays are going to be the quarterback, McKenzie Milton, obviously, nothing there, nothing new there. But Gabriel Davis has been very consistent at the wide receiver spot, and I think you get him in your lineup. Now, excuse me, you have to use you kind of have to figure out your matchups and figure out your depth on whether or not you want to go with an Adrian Killins, whether you want to put an Otis Anderson in there. Do you go with a Dredrick Nelson, who has been very inconsistent, or a Trey Nixon, who I think has only had 2 good games? So you kind of have to feel your roster and your opponent out in order to get those guys in there. And on the East Carolina side, we're seeing a change at quarterback. Holton Ahlers, the quarterback, I think is a freshman for East Carolina, will get the start. I'm curious to see how that affects Trevon Brown, wide receiver, East Carolina. Trevon Brown coming off of his biggest game of the year last week. Now a matchup against Central Florida. Now here's what's interesting. The quarterback that threw Trevon Brown his touchdown pass last week is the quarterback that's getting the start this week. Obviously, East Carolina is going to have to pass the ball often to keep up with Central Florida. Is this another good week for Trevon Brown? Are we seeing him now take off in the second half of the season? I've got my fingers crossed for you fantasy owners. I was very high on Trevon Brown at the beginning of the season, and hopefully he starts to make up what he lacked the first half of the season. Hopefully he makes that up here in the second half. South Florida playing at home against UConn. I do think David Pindell is worth a start in this matchup. South Florida's defense has not been super shut down, and the offense is all David Pindell. But on the South Florida side, Jordan Cronkrite is the must start of this matchup. You can look at Barnett, you can look at receivers for South Florida. I actually think that at the end of week 8, when we look at the running back fantasy points, when we post up the weekly leaders on the website on a Sunday evening and Monday morning, it would not surprise me if Jordan Cronkrite is sitting as the top back at the end of week 8, has the best fantasy week for week 8. Southern Miss playing at home against UTSA. I think in this matchup, Kez Watkins, the wide receiver, is the guy that you're obviously looking at here. Texas State playing on the road at UL Monroe. I do think Caleb Evans is worth a look. I do think Marcus Green, the receiver for UL Monroe, is definitely worth a start. And how good has Keenan Brown, the tight end for Texas State, been? The guy's doing it on the ground. He's doing it in the air. If you're in a league right now that has Keenan Brown available, and I have to tell you, I'm in one. I picked him up. I'm starting him as a receiver in one of my leagues. I think he has been that consistent. Look in your waiver wire and see if a guy like Keenan Brown, Texas State tight end, is available. Ohio State playing on the road at Purdue. This is going to be quite a game to watch. Of some of the later games, this might be the more entertaining one to watch. Over at Ohio State, I don't know where you stop. I don't know where the options stop. Obviously, Haskins is going to be a must start every week. You know, whether or not you want to consider Dobbins and Campbell, that's up in the air. And I think the same thing when it comes to guys like KJ Hill, when it comes to McLaurin. I think it really depends on your matchups, on whether or not you get all of those guys in there. But for me, the slam dunk play is definitely Dwayne Haskins. When you look at Purdue, David Blah has had 2 good games in a row. David Blah is actually going to have a really good game for them to beat or even stay with Ohio State. Well, what does that mean? That means Rondale Moore actually has to have a good name, because if Blah plays well, then Moore's numbers probably look good. They probably correlate to one another, with one another. But I do think that DJ Knox is the X factor in this game. Whether or not he can have a good game remains to be seen. But I'll tell you what I think in my start bench, because he's in that. Oregon playing on the road at Washington State, another game with plenty of options. You've got Justin Herbert, you've got CJ Verdell, and you've got Dylan Mitchell on the Oregon side. You may even want to throw in Jacob Breeland, the tight end. And over on Washington State side, coming off a bye week, tough spot for Oregon, coming off of a big win, playing on the road in Pullman. ESPN game days there. Cougars coming off of a bye. That's going to be a tough matchup for the Ducks. I do think, look, when I say tough, I'm saying tough to win. I don't think they're going to be limited from a fantasy perspective. I think this is going to be a lot of fantasy points in this game. And on the Washington State side, you got Gardner Minshew, you've got Devontavian Martin, you've got the running back James Williams, you've got Aesop Winston. So you've got a bunch of fantasy options in this game, and I think they're all worth starts. this week. Kentucky playing at home against Vanderbilt. I think if you have Kalijah Lipscomb and you've got Keyshawn Vaughn, you may want to leave them on a bench this week. Maybe that's about 3 weeks in a row for Kalijah Lipscomb with bad matchups. But that Kentucky defense has been pretty good, and obviously Benny Snell is a must start this week, who I believe is in our top 5, definitely our top 10 this week. Fresno State playing on the road at New Mexico. New Mexico's an offense that has been playing really well lately, but this is where you probably have to press the pause button. And it's a pretty decent Fresno State defense, so I'm a little hesitant to get somebody like Tyrone Owens, the running back for New Mexico, in my lineup this week. But when you look at Fresno State, I mean, New Mexico's defense hasn't been great. You've got Marcus McMaryion, the quarterback. You've got Keyshawn Johnson, the receiver. I think those are the two guys you're looking at getting in a matchup this week. Rice playing on the road at Florida International. And I have to tell you, I'm going to be honest with you. I missed Austin Walter last week, and somebody emailed me, and I did. Not only did I miss, that was a big miss. I mean, Austin Walter, I want to say he had like 20 touches for like 30 total yards. And you know what? I have to tell you that FIU defense is pretty decent. I'm scared for Walter this week. I think I'm leaving him out of the lineup this week at FIU. And if there's 2 plays, maybe in FBS leagues that you want to consider this week, is James Morgan, the Bowling Green transfer, who actually has thrown for at least 2 touchdowns in 5 consecutive games. And if there's somebody that you want to have on the end of his passes, it's CJ Wharton, who I believe is the Florida transfer, who's actually played pretty well this year as well. That's a nice matchup. If you play in an FBS league and you need 2 guys that you're playing maybe one of the top teams in your league, and you need a matchup that maybe you're just playing for high ceiling points, maybe you take a James Morgan and a Wharton and you say, you know what, if these guys connect for 2 touchdowns, this could be gold. And if Morgan throws more than 2 and Wharton's on the receiving end of both of those, and I throw those 2 names out, not because they're going to be great and not because I'm guaranteeing that, it's because there's a good chance that of all quarterback wide receiver combinations that could be available in your league, maybe this is one of them. UAB playing at home against North Texas. That UAB defense has been playing really good. That does have me a little concerned for fantasy owners of Mason Fine, DeAndre Torrey, Rico Bussey. Right when I was ready to anoint Jalen Darden the next Jalen Guyton, because Jalen Guyton had been quiet, I actually put the hex on him, guys. So you're welcome for those of you guys that had Jalen Guyton. I badmouthed him, and he went ahead and had the best week of all the receivers on the North Texas roster last week. Let's see if he can put two of those together in a row, and let's see if Rico Bussey can have a bounce back game as well. But it won't be easy, and I think for UAB right now, I'm looking at Spencer Brown. Maybe AJ Erdely is an outside shot, but I mentioned UAB's defense has been playing well. North Texas's defense hasn't been bad either. Maybe this game's a little lower scoring than we anticipate. We'll see. Western Kentucky playing at home against Old Dominion, and I think with Old Dominion, you look at Keyshawn Strong. I think in the passing game, you got Jonathan Duhart, Travis Fulgham are both definite options, especially Duhart. Duhart's definitely a must start. I think those are the 3 guys that I'm looking at. Western Michigan, I'm still trying to figure out. I just don't know if we have a legitimate fantasy option on that side, and that's why I'm leaning with the 3 plays over on the Old Dominion side. USC playing at Utah in one of the evening games on Saturday. I think Utah at home's tough matchup. I think Zach Moss should get him in there. After last week's game, Tyler Huntley looks like a legitimate threat to throw in there as a quarterback too. And over on the USC side, I mean, the passing game came alive, right? JT Daniels, Michael Pittman last week. I just don't know what we're going to get out of that USC run game. And you know what? This is going to be a game if you have a USC player. I think you take a shot at a receiver like a Pittman, a Vaughns, and a Amon-Ra St. Brown, because one, we don't know what they're going to get from we do not know what we're going to get from the USC running backs, but we can almost guarantee that we're not going to get much this weekend because Utah has one of the best run defenses in the college football. So I think they're going to force Daniels to put the ball in the air, and whether or not the freshman can make the plays like he did last week will be the biggest question and how this game will actually be decided. Arizona playing on the road at UCLA, and Khalil Tate, a guy that I have been, I hate to say it. I don't want to say I've been bashing him, but I've been saying ever since he had the big game to trade him because he wasn't going to be worth squat. He just doesn't look like Khalil Tate from 2017. He's obviously been nursing an injury. I actually think that Arizona is going to look better in this game with Rhett Rodriguez at quarterback. They're a healthy quarterback. You don't have to worry about whether or not he's going to run the ball. He can find receivers, whether it's Harris, whether it's Poindexter. It remains to be seen. But you know what? They're playing. This is an interesting matchup because UCLA has been playing well lately. And I said last week that if UCLA didn't beat Cal or Arizona, then they were facing the possibility of an 0-12 season. And they went ahead and beat Cal last week, and now they get Arizona. And if there's a player that you want from UCLA, unquestionably, undoubtedly, it is Joshua Kelly. You need to start him this week. San Diego State playing at home against San Jose State. When Chase Jasmine took over for Juwan Washington, when Washington went down with that broken collarbone, many fantasy owners, including myself, were expecting Chase Jasmine to pick up where Juwan Washington left off. All of a sudden now, concussion protocol. Does he play? Doesn't he play? Question marks surrounding him. Here's one thing that I'm going to throw out there for you guys and for you all that watch this show in regards to injuries. The concussion thing for me, the concussion protocol for me, is one of the injuries that I don't wish it on any player, but from a fantasy owner, for me, it's the easiest one to deal with because the guy's, it's not like he's running on a bummed ankle or he's playing with a bad shoulder and he can't take contact. He's either cleared or he's not. And if Jasmine is cleared, he is healthy. He can have a huge game in this San Jose State matchup. Now, whether or not they give it all to him because he's missed some time, maybe some time in practice, remains to be seen. Maybe Keegan Williams gets a few extra carries in there as well. But for me, if Chase Jasmine's cleared, he's 100% go. He's a must start this week in that matchup. And on the last matchup of the weekend, Nevada playing on the road at Hawaii. A lot of fantasy owners will, in FBS leagues, will have a lot of interest in this game with obviously McDonald or Sue or Bird playing in this matchup. You've got Drayton Fiorota, the tight end, actually the running back who has tight end status on Fantrax as well. And over on the Nevada side, right, you've got, Ty Ganji returned. His return last week meant that McLean Maddox actually came back in the fold as a decent play. Caleb Fossum did have a little drop off. It'll be interesting to see if he has a bounce back week. If he does, maybe you take a chance on him given your matchups and given the matchup of that particular game, which should have quite a few points in it. But if you have Ganji, you have McLean Maddox, along with the Hawaii players that I mentioned, you go ahead and get them in your lineup this week. So, guys, that takes care of the slate. We're going to get right into the start bench. And I'm going to kind of jump around because I want to go with some of the interesting names last. But like I said, on the bench list, I'm going to start with the bench list. And interesting, I scratched the guy off late because I just don't think he's going to play. And I didn't want to include a guy that on the bench list that wasn't going to play anyway. So here's where I'll start. I'll start with Nick Fitzgerald, quarterback, Mississippi State, playing on the road at LSU. Now, here's some stats to throw out at you. In Fitzgerald's first two starts of the season, both non-conference games, the Bulldogs averaged 43.5 points per game. In the three conference games since, Mississippi State has only averaged 12 points per game, and Fitzgerald has only averaged 106 total yards of offense. He's coming off a solid outing at home against Auburn, like I mentioned earlier in the show. He did that last week, but there's no doubt he's going to have a target on his chest this weekend in Death Valley, in Baton Rouge. And I think for me, Nick Fitzgerald is a Week 8 bench on the road against a tough LSU defense. Karan Higdon, running back Michigan, playing at Michigan State. Last week, and I mentioned this early in the show, last week we suggested benching Penn State running back Miles Sanders against Michigan State, and he exploded for 162 yards and a touchdown. However, the Spartans' defense was locked in on quarterback Trace McSorley, who had his worst game of the season. The Wolverines don't have a Trace McSorley, which makes running back Karan Higdon and the Michigan running game priority number one for that Michigan State defense. Despite Sanders' 162-yard rushing game last weekend, Michigan State still leads the nation in rushing yards allowed per game. They're only allowing 62.3 points per game, and I think Michigan's going to have to try to find a way to get it done in the air. I'm not saying Higdon is not going to have a decent game. He could. Maybe he finds the end zone. I just don't see him having a monster game this week. Let's see. Cedric Ware, running back, USC, playing on the road at Utah. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but Ware, the running back, USC, playing at Utah. Now, Ware has led the Trojans in rushing in 4 of their 6 games this season, and he's actually topped the 100-yard mark twice this year. However, his 2 100-yard rushing games were against teams that are now averaging about 200 rushing yards per game, UNLV and Arizona. Utah has the nation's second best run defense. So I would expect Utah to bottle up Ware and the USC run game and force freshman JT Daniels to beat them in the air. And for me, Ware, the running back USC, is a week 8 bench at Utah. One more on the bench list, and we're going to go with Lexington Thomas, running back UNLV, playing at home against Air Force. So this is a home bench for Lexington Thomas, who was unbelievable at the beginning of the year. After rushing for at least 80 yards and a touchdown in each of the first 4 games this season, and 3 of those were 100-yard games, Lexington Thomas's numbers have plummeted the last 2 games without quarterback Amani Rodgers, who is missing time because of an injury. Not only is the loss of Rodgers that makes Thomas a risky pick this weekend, but the defense that he's facing actually compounds the problem. Air Force has the 9th best run defense in the nation. They're allowing just over 100 yards per game on the ground. The Falcons limited San Diego State to 84 yards on the ground last week, and they can also claim to have held FAU's Devin Singletary to his lowest rushing total in the past 19 games, 57 yards, back in week 2 earlier this year. That Air Force run defense is pretty good, guys, and I think Lexington Thomas is a week 8 bench for UNLV. Here we go. Let's go into the starts. I've got 5 names for you. We've got 3 running backs and we've got 2 quarterbacks, and I'm going to start with Nathan Rourke because I think he's the most obvious one. Now, I say he's the most obvious one, but he's not going to be an obvious choice for many fantasy owners that have experienced his up and down season thus far. You know, the junior quarterback has accounted for more than 2 touchdowns in a game one time this season. He's only accounted for more than 2 touchdowns in a game once this year. He did that 8 times in 2017, so he is not having a 2017 Nathan Rourke season. However, Bowling Green has the nation's worst statistical rushing defense. They're allowing 324 yards per game on the ground, and they've given up 31 rushing touchdowns. Expect Rourke to boost his touchdown total and extend Bowling Green's streak of allowing a 100-yard rusher to 7 consecutive weeks. That's what happens if Rourke or one of the Ohio players goes over 100 yards rushing this week. It will have been in 7 straight games. Jet Duffy, quarterback, Texas Tech, playing at home against Kansas. I mentioned early in the show that I do like Jet Duffy playing against Kansas this weekend. And you know what? Duffy wasn't great last week against TCU, but he was good enough to lead them to a come-from-behind 4th quarter win. His highlights included a 62-yard touchdown pass and a 38-yard TD run in the middle of the 4th quarter that actually put them ahead in that game. This week, Duffy should have a few more highlight opportunities against a Kansas defense that are allowing 37 points per game since they've started conference play. And for me, that makes Jet Duffy a week 8 start against Kansas. Marcus Outlow, running back, Coastal Carolina, playing on the road at Massachusetts. And here's what I'll have to say about that. Marcus Outlow currently leads the team in rushing, right? He's only got 533 yards. He has scored 7 touchdowns, so he's had a decent season. He's on pace for 1,000 yards. He's had 2 100-yard rushing games this season, and he's had at least 14 carries and a touchdown in 5 consecutive games going into this week's matchup against UMass, who have the 3rd worst defense in the FBS against the run. UMass is allowing 271 yards per game on the ground. Only 4 teams have given up more rushing touchdowns than the 21 that UMass have allowed. I think this is a good combination for Marcus Outlow. Get him in your lineup this week against UMass. Here's 2 good ones. I'm going to save the surprise maybe for last, but I'll go with Darrell Henderson. And you know, it's hard for me to say Like, one thing that I try to do with these start bench lists is that obviously you guys notice I don't throw out obvious starts on here. I could throw out a top 5 guy every week and kind of hit them on the head. That's not how I like to roll with the start bench. I like to include guys on the start bench that, as the emails come in at the beginning of the week, seem to be guys and players that have the most questions around them. So yeah, I don't maybe hit as many as I could or that I'd like, but I think I'm handling a lot of the emails that come in and maybe addressing these players for a lot of you guys that do not send in emails as well. But for me, week 8, Darrell Henderson, the running back for Memphis, playing at Missouri, is a start. And on paper, this weekend's matchup at Missouri may cause some fantasy owners to think twice about starting Henderson. The real problem is this. Henderson has spoiled his fantasy owners this year. He's rushed for at least 170 yards 5 times and scored at least 2 touchdowns in all but 1 game. He has spoiled you guys. So now all of a sudden you're afraid he's not going to run for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns, and you're afraid to get him in your lineup. The only 2 games in which the junior back has not rushed for 100 yards this year, he has scored at least 2 touchdowns in. That's how consistent Darrell Henderson has been. College fantasy football is definitely about playing the matchups. I would not argue about that. But how can you sit a player that has topped the 20-point mark every week this season and is averaging 5 points more than the next best fantasy back to date? Darrell Henderson is a week 8 start, even if you have to get him in as a flex. Get him in. And here's the last one. This might be a little bit of a surprise, so I saved it for last. I actually think DJ Knox, the running back for Purdue, playing at home against Ohio State, is a week 8 start this week. And here's why. If Purdue is to pull off an upset at home against Ohio State this weekend, running back DJ Knox is going to play a major role in that game. Now check this out. In 7 games this season, Ohio State has allowed 4 150-yard rushers. The most recent being just last week, Minnesota's Mohamed Ibrahim. He did it just last week. They have allowed 4 150-yard rushers. Knox has at least 15 carries in 4 of the last 5 games, has rushed for at least 150 yards in 2 of the last 5 games, and has posted at least 19 fantasy points in 3 of the last 5. I wouldn't hesitate to get Knox in a flex position this weekend against an Ohio State defense that has been notorious this year for allowing 150-yard rushers. And there it is from me, my call of the week, DJ Knox in your starting lineup, week 8. So that's it, guys. That takes care of the slate this week, and that takes care of the start bench. And let's see, best quarterback you like this week between Murray, Locke, Tiamu, and McSorley. And I have to tell you, I think Murray is higher in the rankings this week. But I would take Murray over Locke. I would take Murray over Tiamu. I almost think Murray is a must start every single week. But if you are having concerns about playing TCU, because they are a decent defense, after the game McSorley had last week, I think he's in for a big game. I'm amazed that you have a roster with Locke, Tiamu, McSorley, and Murray. For me, my first question is, how can I get in your league? But I think you've got 2 good options no matter which way you go there. I'm hoping for your sake, maybe you're in a 2 quarterback league and you got both of those guys. So listen, for all you guys tuning into the show, we are finishing up week 8. We're getting into week 9 next week. We may start getting into some of the names and players that you want to start looking into as we move into the last 3 or 4 weeks into the regular season, and maybe start game planning around some playoff positioning with your roster and how to look at things and how to build your roster heading into my philosophy with building your roster via trades or whatnot in waiver wire as we head into the season. So I'll go ahead and try to remember to jump into that next week. But look, guys, thanks for jumping in. Thanks for coming on to the show. And thanks for everybody that watches it on replay. The support is greatly appreciated. The one thing that I'll mention is go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Hit that alert button, and when we go live every week, you'll get alerted that we're actually going live. So if you're watching this on replay and you haven't subscribed to the channel and hit that little bell button to be alerted, go ahead and do that this week. And we'll see you next week, week 9. Good luck this week, guys.